Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Catherine Muma and I am a photographer and Photoshop artist. I do everything from your normal everyday portrait photography to something a little more fantastic and surreal, as you can see in these examples. Today you're going to be following along with me as we do a sports composite in Photoshop. This is an example of one I did with my daughter. I just kind of took her outside after a game. The sun was setting, it was getting pretty dark, and I just had her run around and I took a few pictures. So I'm kind of limited on what I have of her. You can see here I am racing against the sun going down. So every picture was just a little darker than the next. But we'll use them and you'll get the idea and be able to use what I show you here in your own composites. So ultimately it ended up looking like this, and it's just a random texture that I chose to be in the background. You can use whatever texture that you want. I just grabbed from a free pack that I got off the internet for the purpose of this tutorial. So you're going to go up to the menu bar, click File, click New. This is going to bring you to the New Document panel. You're going to click on Photo up in the menu bar, and then you're going to click on View All Presets because it's not going to show the one that we need, which is the Landscape 10:8. We also want to make sure that our resolution matches that of our pictures that we're going to be using. You can name it first of all. So I'm going to name mine Soccer Composite. Now click Create and we have our canvas. Make sure all the photos that you want to use are open in Photoshop. Going to go into one of our pictures. So click one of your picture tabs. It's always good to start with the first one. That way you know what you're looking at here. All right, so now we're getting into the fun stuff. We want to get everything else out of here and just leave our subject, our soccer player here. Okay, so when you're trying to cut out your athlete, the first thing you want to do is get as close to the athlete as possible. So when you go up to the view menu, you can enlarge to 200 and see if that fits them completely on the screen. If it's too much, you can back up to 100, or on your keyboard you can use Command minus or Command plus to go in and out. I like to get my subject from head to toe as much as possible, filling the screen from top to bottom. And then I'm going to come over here and I'm going to use the Quick Selection tool. It is my favorite tool to use when selecting my subject. Sometimes it wants to select more than your subject. It wants to go out beyond the boundaries. And the key to getting the best possible selection is to make sure that your brush size is not too big. So I'm going to bring mine down a little. Let's see what it looks like at 70. That's a little bit more like it. So let's start selecting. And the thing about this, see how it's going a little wider there, but then it thinks about it and it thinks about what you want to select and it makes a better selection. If you look over here, you're going to see a couple options. There's a minus and a plus. This is usually selected by default, but you're going to want to have it for now. You're going to want it at the plus because you're going to want to go in pieces here, and then this will add the selection to what you've already chosen. Now see, it wants to choose the sidewalk and part of the house because I dragged it. So you got to be careful that it's not choosing that, because once you cut it out of here, it gets harder to get rid of some of this stuff. But the beauty of this is I can then use my minus tool. I'm going to make my brush a little bit smaller because that's usually an indicator that my brush was too big when it starts to select outside of my subject. And I'm just going to tap on the parts that I don't want and watch it shrink back down to what I really do want. Now you'll see there's still part of the house there. It's really small, So I'm going to need to make my brush even smaller, okay? Cutting out your subject can be time consuming, but it's worth doing well. It's sometimes worth even going into the pixels using Command Plus and just seeing how good that selection is. You can see right here it's kind of bleeding into her a little too much. That's fine. If it's like plus or minus a pixel or two, it's no big deal. But when it starts grabbing things like here, it's not going over her whole hand. We want her whole hand, and it's going to be harder to recoup later. So for now, let's back up. We're going to use Command minus on a Mac. I'm still in negative selection mode, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this patch of grass here. And I'm just tapping, and I'm kind of letting it do the work, the brain work on what I want it to get rid of. If I do too much dragging, it will cut out parts of her. See, it's already kind of doing it here. The reason it's doing that is because the green, it's having a hard time differentiating between the green of her jersey and the green of the grass. I'm gonna go ahead and make my brush even smaller and get rid of that. All right, so now I have chosen the plus selection tool, and I'm trying to get her hand back here, and as I shown you before, it keeps wanting to go outside of that. Like I said, the smaller you make your brush, the more controlled you can get. I want to make sure I get her finger there. All right, so I'm gonna get that piece of jersey back. There we go. All right, now I'm gonna make my brush bigger. Notice I'm in plus selection mode, and I'm gonna continue. There's my daughter's little scar. Continue on down. Like I said, I'm just kind of tapping, dragging maybe a little bit so that I can let it know what I want it to get. This has high contrast between the black and the grass, so it's going to get pretty good. Might have some trouble around this Nike symbol here because it's green. But it's going to be pretty good at knowing I want the shoe. There's a little bit of shoe missing there, so I'm going to go in. Just tapping. So I do have a little advantage that I'm not sure if you will have in your class. I am using a Wacom tablet as opposed to a mouse or the keyboard mouse pad. It's a pen and tablet. It offers way more control over everything that you see me doing. So if you're not getting your selection perfect, if you're getting frustrated, just know I have an advantage to really getting into the details here. So please don't get discouraged. I need to be able to do this fast so I can teach you guys as fast as possible. So I'm going back up. Hair is always fun. When I say fun, I'm being completely sarcastic. It is so hard to get hair right. But sports composites can be pretty forgiving of that kind of thing because you're going to be putting your subject over a texture. So yes, you can see why hair is a pain in the neck, and we're going to do as best we can to pull this out. If you have a subject with a lot of hair that's flying around, you're just going to want to get in as much as possible and cut it out. So let's keep concentrating on cutting our subjects out. This is going to be interesting because of the green. Gotta really teach it about the boundary that I want here under her arm. Pretty good. All right, that's pretty good. And then, of course, it selects it again when I go down the arm. So I have the whole arm selected. It keeps wanting to select the grass and the sidewalk. And this is when the magnetic lasso tool might come in handy if you're just getting sick of going back and forth. Let me show you what I mean by that. This is the magnetic lasso tool's version of the plus, and this is the minus. If it's on here, it's going to erase everything that you've done, so don't do that. You want to make sure you're adding to your selection. You'll see on the magnetic lasso tool, there's a little plus there. That means you got it right, okay? But I don't want to use a plus. I want to use a minus. I want to get stuff out. So I'm just going to circle around what I want out of my selection. You can also do it with just the normal lasso tool. That way you don't have to perfectly join one end to the other. So that's pretty good. I'm going to zoom out here. You're going to come down here at the bottom of your layers tab, and you're going to see these little icons. This one is the layer masking tool. It is going to take out everything except for what you have selected. So you'll see here, you've got a black box. That's everything that got taken out. And then there's a little bit of white there. That's our subject. Okay? The beauty of doing it this way and not erasing everything is that it's not destructive. You can always bring stuff back, and here's how. This is a little Photoshop trick some of you might already know. You're going to come up to your brush tool here. And let's, for the purposes of example, make our brush bigger here so we can see a nice circle. And then you're going to have your paint modes here, your paint colors. There's black and white. White reveals, black conceals is how we say it. Let's say I did want to have that ball. I want to bring it back. I'm going to hit these arrows here. It swaps the white, puts it on the top. And I'm just going to bring that ball back. Okay, I was a little messy about it. And there's a better way of doing that, but I'm just doing this for an example to show you how white reveals, black conceals when you're dealing with these layer masks. So nothing is gone forever. All right, but I'm gonna undo that because I want that ball gone. Here's another thing you can do. If you go over to this little tab right here with the 3 squares and the arrow, that's your history tab. You can see almost everything you've done. After a while it times out, so there's only so many that it remembers, but you can go up pretty far into your history and undo things. So I could go all the way back to here, and it brings me to before I selected the legs. But I don't want to do that. I just want to get rid of when I brought the ball back. So I'm going to go back to add layer mask, and my ball is gone. The brush tool that I used, all those brush strokes are also gone. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to come over here and we're going to select our move tool. And that's going to give us the ability to select our subject, tap on the subject, make sure she's selected, and we're going to move our subject over the tab of our canvas that we made. So soccer composite, you see it up there. I don't let go yet. You're going to keep dragging your subject until it's on the canvas. And then you let go, and there she is. Okay, so this is assuming that you have cut out all your subjects from all your pictures. I have just plopped everything on here like I said. Another thing that I did is I went ahead and edited some of these. If you remember, some of them were quite dark. So I brightened them up a little bit on my own, and I put them all in groups, as you can see here in my layer tab, all the brightening that I did, adding some saturation. That's all something that we're not going to get into here, but you can do on your own time as needed for your own photos. But I wanted to let you know that is why my photos are in groups right now. But we're still going to be able to do everything that we need to do with these, and you can still follow along the same way. So now we want to place these guys where we want them. So make sure that the group or layer, depending on if you edited first, is selected. And make sure your move tool is selected. Something that you always kind of have to do when you're working with a lot of layers is it always helps to click a point on the outside of your box that shows up, because if you don't and you start dragging things around, when layers are behind each other, you might end up grabbing the wrong layer and dragging that around instead. And Photoshop isn't really good at knowing when there's multiple layers which one you want to grab, even if you have selected it over here. So make sure you always select a point in the bounding box, and once you do that, you can grab what you need to grab without it dragging something else. It's kind of like a puzzle, just figuring out where everything goes. Okay, so I'm kind of liking where everything is at. So if we want to get really into the weeds with this, you know, you can be as picky as you want about selecting the outer edges of your subject when you're cutting it out of your picture. And as you can see here, there's parts of her arm that aren't so smooth, but that gives me an opportunity to show you how to clean things up if you need to. So let's go ahead and go in on this one here. I'm going to go ahead and go into my layer, because everything in my group is, like I said, my little edits to brighten and give it more saturation. But if I double click right here on the mask, it brings me to the select and mask window. I can choose to see the picture as a cutout, or if I drag this transparency slider up here, I can see the old picture and what was there. Just don't get too confused. Make sure that you always know what your transparency is at. But if I look at this piece of hair here, it actually wasn't hair, it was part of this yard here. So I'm going to get rid of that. And then the fuzziness around her arm, we'll zoom into that too. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Command plus. Really get into the pixels on this. And again, it doesn't have to be 100% perfect, because you're going to be putting a texture underneath it, but you do want it to blend. The better it blends, the better it's going to look. So there's some options over here that you can see if it helps. If you move these sliders and it smooths it down, but you know, no matter if I feather or whatever, it's going to affect my entire cutout. As you can see, it's going to affect the other side of her arm. Sometimes that works if you have a big halo around your entire subject and you know that you want to shift the edge over or feather it or make it smoother. I'm probably going to end up feathering the whole thing anyway, just not so much. But if we're looking to just cut out specific parts that we didn't like, these are the brushes we want to look at. So here's another version of the quick selection tool that we used last time. It's just as picky and weird about things as it is outside of this window. So for this, I like to use the brush tool because you have more control with the brush tool. And up here you have your plus and minus. So obviously in this instance, plus is going to add to your selection, minus is going to take away. I'm going to make this a little smaller. So I have the plus and it brings back the grass. I'm going to go ahead and undo. So for this I want to select the minus. And remember, you only want your brush as small as what you're trying to take away. So that's about right there. And I'm just going to make little strokes to kind of even out that arm a little bit and make that a little bit smoother. And it does the same thing where it kind of guesses what you really want taken away and conforms to it a little bit. You can see I'm getting a smoother line there. If I want to, I can look at the transparency here and bring that up a little bit and see if there's any parts of her arm that I need to bring back. And as you can see, I actually do. I'm actually erasing parts of her arm that I need back instead of doing myself a favor here. So good thing I brought up that transparency. See, it's not always perfect with us professionals either. There's always something to learn. Always something. So in this case, we do want to use our plus, and I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger, but not too big. I don't want to start accidentally picking the grass. So I'm going to draw that arm back in within that outline of her arm. So this can be kind of a tedious process, but I wanted to call it out because if you have the time and you're looking to make this the best project that you can make it, this is a good thing to do. When I'm doing a project for my work, I definitely go deep into the pixels, like zoom way and really work on everything, and then zoom out. And the further you zoom out, you can almost see the outline and does it look good or not. So that's looking pretty good. I mean, it's not perfect, but like I said, we're going to be working with texture in the background, so it's not going to be as noticeable. And if it is, once you have the texture there, if you're seeing more stuff, you can always go back into this window. So see here, we're seeing a little extra. I'm seeing the grass here outlining her hand. So that's when I get really picky and I bring my brush size way down to like 2 or 3, and I hit the minus there and I just start taking away. I even zoom in more as much as I can. So if we go over here, I want to just show you this real quick. You'll see some of the fingers are cut off, and when you're cutting out a smaller subject, the quick selection tool just isn't always perfect. So if you have your transparency at a point where you can see where those tips of those fingers were, you can bring them back using this brush. So hitting the plus, I have my brush still very small. I'll actually bring that up a little bit, maybe to about a 6. It's better. You don't want overkill with your brush size because it will always select more pixels than you want, and then you're going back and forth, and it's already a pretty tedious process. So just bringing back her fingers there. And then you'll see there's some grass that was selected too. So once again, making my brush size as small as I need it to be, clicking the minus, and just kind of going around the fingers now and deselecting all of that. There's some lines here. So this is perfecting it, you know, like I said, but I wanted to show you some instances that you might run into and what you can do about it. Let's look around and see if there's anything else before I move to the next step. Oh, hair. Remember how I told you how fun hair is? Well, you can see here as I go back and forth with the transparency, little curls at the end of her ponytail go away, and then they come back. This is one of the steps to getting your hair looking natural after a cutout. It's definitely one of the most challenging things to restore. And there's some magic that you got to do. So start by bringing back the hairs that you see. I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger, just a little bit. And just kind of paint it back in from what I see here. Because there's so many holes in the hair, it's very easy to select the wrong thing. If you know that you have a large chunk that isn't there and you want to bring that transparency almost all the way down, you can, just to get a better idea of what you're trying to get. Just kind of scribble it all in there. I'm going to back up and take a look at what that looks like now. A little better, a little better. It's not perfect. If you watch the top of her head and all these flyaways here, those will go away too. And that is a very natural part of having a ponytail. It's the little flyaways that come up. So it does look a little fake when it's cut out. There is a great tutorial on how to make your own hair brush in Photoshop, and you can paint the hairs back in. And the tutorial is by Pix Imperfect. So if you look up Pix Imperfect, P-I-X Imperfect, all one word, on YouTube, he's a great teacher and he does a great job in explaining how to make your own custom hairbrush. So definitely look into that if you have the time. But for now, let me get rid of this bush here that I've added to her head. Just little strokes. Really close to her head. There's some dark stuff up here that I wanted to get rid of too. Smooth it out a little bit more. Okay. So that is how you go into your selection window and really just get picky about it. Another thing I said I was going to do was feather it a little bit so there's not so many hard edges. So I'm going to actually bring the smoothing out a little, way to about 15. Let's see how that looks. Like I said, it's going to do it to all the edges, so you don't want to go too much because it's going to look like that. So we're just going to bring it back just to where the first few pixels into the edge are feathered. And that looks nice. Okay, I'm going to click OK. And we're back into the main window, Photoshop. Here's another example here on this one. There's a little flyaway coming off of her there. I would go ahead and go into that same window, paint that out. I'd paint out this here, this under her arm. Okay, her hand here has some grass in it. And so does her leg here. Her leg here is a little lumpy. So those are just some examples of other things I would do. This one needs some cleaning up here around her hand. I'd maybe take some of the grass out of her hair here. So all that will be cleaned up. Okay, we have cut out all our subjects. We have refined our selections. We have placed everything where we want them to be. And now we are going to pick out a texture to put in the background. The one I used was called Abstract Inferno. And it's kind of this grungy looking fiery texture. I do end up taking the saturation out of it so that the color is not distracting. You can find all kinds of textures online. You can even take photos of different textures yourself and use those. Funny story, my husband's phone turns on when it's in the pocket of his coat, and it takes pictures of the inside of his pocket. And if there's light shining through, you get a pretty cool effect that's a lot like this one here. So I use that sometimes for backgrounds. But I do find that I prefer grungier textures for sports composites. This is all to taste and depends on your own preference, what looks good to you. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring this into Photoshop. And what I just do is I just drag it right over. It creates its own layer. It's not always in the right spot though. As you can see, some of my subjects are behind the layer. At least this one is. So what I will do with the layer selected and checked, because I don't mind where it is right now, I will click Layer in the menu bar, and I will go down to Arrange and hit Send to Back. That will send it all the way to the back. And then what we're going to want to do, selecting our Move tool here, my tools changed a little bit. There we go. I like them like that. With my layer selected, I'm going to make sure Show Transform Controls is checked so I can see the bounding box. And I'm going to go ahead and just pull this. Now, we don't have to worry too much about it becoming pixely because it is a texture, and if it's not our main subject, it's not going to look too weird if we're seeing a little loss of quality. Once we get everything blended in there, it should look pretty nice. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the check mark. And I can always adjust it once we get going with blending our subjects in. So just a side lesson here, if you want to make a group, if you put some adjustment layers over top of a subject layer, so say I put some curves on, I'm going to make sure the curves only apply to this layer. So I'm going to hit my Option key, get my square and my arrow, and connect that so it only affects that layer. But then you want to make a group, because you're going to want to make adjustments to the group as a whole later on. So you're going to make sure that your layer and all your adjustments pertaining to that layer are selected. And then you're going to hit Control-click, and you're going to see Group from Layers. I'm terrible at naming things. You're going to see nothing here is named. But you are more than welcome to be way more organized than me and name your layers, name your groups, so you know what you're looking at. Then click OK, and you have your group. These adjustment layers I use to kind of brighten her up, but they're also going to be useful for helping us really see our subject after it gets blended in to our texture. So I'm going to keep my curves layer on. I just brightened her up a bit using the curves layer. But first, before we add those adjustment layers, I want to give you an idea for how we blend this into our texture. So if you see here in the layers panel, there's an opacity drop-down menu. You're going to slide that slider until you can just start seeing texture on your subject. I like mine at about 75. That looks pretty good right there. Now, you can see that it's kind of faded looking. Let's start with how we're going to get this to pop. So what we want to do is we want to duplicate this layer. You can go up to Layer, Duplicate Layer, make a copy of it. Okay. If you have any adjustment layers, just bring it up over top. And then with this layer selected, making sure that this box, not our mask, is selected. We want the box with the picture in it. We're going to go up to Filter, Other, High Pass. And what you're looking for when you see this, it's going to make a sharpened version of your subject. What we really want is the details to not look too thin, but not too thick either. See, there it's a little too much, okay? We want to get it to where there's going to be some contrast here. So when you just start to see those details darken, that's where you want to have your pixels at in this slider. So click OK. And what we're going to do is we're going to select a blending mode. From this drop-down menu in the Layers tab here, you're going to see Normal is selected by default. We're going to go down. These are all different groups of blending modes. These are the darkening blending modes. These are the lightening blending modes. But what we want to do is go into overlay, okay? Because we're blending in those harsh, sharpened edges to our original subject. Now you can kind of decide what you like best as you rifle through these. But you can see overlay is kind of like medium sharp. Soft light softens it a little bit more. Hard light gives it even more harder than overlay. And then you get into vivid light and linear light. And now we're really talking sharpness here, okay? Pin light's very tiny. You don't want to go there. So I like vivid light. I think it gives us the perfect amount of contrast and detail that we're going to need to see our subject here. So now that we have our subject sharpened, we're going to start looking at adjustment layers. You can see I already have one here. It's the curves layer. Right now it's affecting the whole project, and I don't really want that right now. I want it to only be affecting my subject that I'm working on right now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Alt or Option, and if I hover over the line between curves, my curves adjustment layer and my layer, I get this square and an arrow that points down. With that visible, I'm going to click on it, and it's going to attach directly to my subject. And I'm going to do that with other adjustment layers here. So make sure that your layer, your original layer, is selected. You're going to go up to adjustments. And one thing I like to do is take out some of the saturation that I'm seeing in the photo. There's a couple ways to do this. One is vibrance, this upside down triangle here. I'm going to pull the vibrance tab back and she's going to start getting kind of the silver look. I like the silver look. It's kind of statuesque, if you will. But I don't want to take out too much color. I still want to get the idea that her shirt is green, all that. So I'm going to just slide around until I get the look I'm going for. That right there is okay. And then you can also drag the saturation slider down. Again, we don't want to completely take the color out. We're just trying to get it to kind of look cool and let the colors of the background pop on her. So there you go. I'm liking the way that looks. She's blended in with our texture. If you think that your subject needs to pop more, another thing that you can do is go to brightness and contrast. And you'll notice that I didn't have to do the Alt hold down to make this arrow appear. If you have your layer selected or a layer just above it that's already connected, your adjustment layer that you click on will connect to it as well. So I'm going to go into contrast here and just slide it up. See if I like that any better. Give it a little bit of a mood here. So that's without. It's with. I like it about right there. Another thing I think I want to do is, even though I blended the high pass layer, I still want it to be even more blended in. So I'm going to pull it back a little bit more. You'll see the sharpness really helps, but you might not want too much of it. So I'm going to leave it about right there. So that's looking pretty good. So another way of blending is kind of a hidden way. You're going to go to the right side of the name in your layer, or if you have a group like I do, the right side of your group name. Double click there and a layer style window should show up. Now you're going to see blending options, general blending, advanced blending. We're going to go down to blend if. This is the one we want here. We're going to look at the sliders on the underlying layer, and we're going to be telling Photoshop how much of the underlying layer we want to see. Do we want to see the dark parts? Do we want to see the light? So if you look at the subject, as I slide this slider here, you'll see the white, lighter parts are starting to come through. And obviously she's completely disappearing. So we don't want that, obviously, but if we go down to the dark part, it's going to bring up this kind of natural vignette that's going on here on the corner. And I kind of want it to look like she's sprouting out of there. So the reason I grabbed the whole group and not just the layer is because we also want this high pass version of her that we made to be a part of this, to kind of sync back as well. So as I slide, you're going to see the black and darker parts are starting to take her over. We don't want that to be so harsh. I kind of like it at 65 there, but if I want it to be a little bit more of a gradual blend, I am going to hold down the Alt Option key and click on that arrow, and you'll see it spreads apart. And then I can take the other side, and the more I spread it apart, the more it kind of blends. So right about there, maybe. You can always look at the before and after by toggling the preview off and on. And this is totally personal preference. It depends on your subject. Obviously, it depends on your background as to whether this is going to work for you, but it just so happens that I have this smattering of dark here, and I just thought it would be cool to have her kind of busting out of that. So I'm gonna leave it like that for now. I don't like this grid. Not sure why I have a grid there. So now it's time to close that group, and I'm actually going to go in order here now. I just wanted to show you that one because it was the biggest of them all. If you want to vary your subjects a little bit, you might want to do it depending on the color of the texture that's behind a particular layer. That's totally fine. Your settings don't all have to be the same for each layer. Here is the finished product, and you're probably saying, where did the color go? I decided it was a little distracting, even though it matched her ball, even though it was a complementary color to her jersey. I just didn't like the way it looked like she was playing in fire, and I felt it was just a little extreme and distracting, so I decided to go with a more neutral color. When I brought in my background, it made it a smart object. You can see when I hover over it, it says Smart Object Thumbnail. If you want to make changes, if this happens to you, double click on your smart object. It's going to bring you to another project window, and you're going to make changes within this window. So like in my case, I went up to adjustments, I hit black and white, I clicked on the default settings and just made it black and white, and then I hit save. Obviously it was saved because it's grayed out, I can't do it again. But you have to hit save in order for what you do here to show up in your main project window. So make sure you do that. If it's not a smart object, you can go ahead and make your changes the way you normally would to any layer. I also put a color fill over top here to bring just a little bit of a complementary color into the photo and not make it look so gray. What I do with the color fill is I come down here to this circle, I choose solid color, and it's going to, I'll show you. The opacity is going to be completely full, normal. You make sure you put it behind your subject and over top of your background. I changed the blend mode to hard light, and then I brought down my opacity just so slightly showing. So it's still kind of neutral looking, but with a little tint. So this is your basic sports composite, and I've seen many different types out there. I've seen where there's 10 versions of the athlete playing 4 different sports, and everybody's project is going to look different. So keep it fun, keep it creative, and I can't wait to see what you do. I hope I get to see it, and thanks for watching.